Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Have you ever seen someone get so power hungry they try to claim your land as community property? That's exactly what my new neighbors did. Then their lawyer doubled down in writing. So I stopped debating and made one move that triggered police, board members, and total chaos at my front gate. Was I about to get arrested on my own property? The setup. 3 months ago, I closed on what I thought was the perfect property. It's what real estate agents call a flag lot. Basically a beautiful house sitting at the end of a long, winding driveway that stretches about 300 yards from the main road. The driveway curves through some trees and opens up to my house, which sits on about 2 acres of land. Most people driving by assume it's just a cul-de-sac serving multiple houses, but it's actually my private driveway leading only to my property. The house borders a neighborhood called something like Eagle Crest or Eagle Ridge, one of those generic names developers love. It's your typical HOA community with identical houses, manicured lawns, and apparently a board of directors who think they run a small country instead of a subdivision. When I was house hunting, my realtor mentioned that I wouldn't be part of the HOA since my property predates their development by about 30 years. That was actually a selling point for me. I've heard enough horror stories about HOAs to know I wanted no part of their drama. For the first 2 months, everything was peaceful. I kept to myself, maintained my property, and minded my own business. My driveway happens to connect near the back section of the neighborhood, where 3 houses have their rear garages facing toward my direction. I noticed these neighbors occasionally use the wider area near my house to turn their large SUVs around rather than backing out of their narrow driveways, but I didn't think much of it. The area is paved and it didn't hurt anything, so I let it slide. That was my first mistake. The demand. Last month, I came home from work to find a thick envelope stuffed in my door. Inside was an official-looking document titled Special Assessment Notice, with my address listed at the top. I assumed it was some kind of tax thing until I read the first line. As a beneficiary of shared infrastructure within the Eagle Crest community, you are hereby assessed. The bottom line hit me like a brick. They wanted $8,500 from me for road maintenance and community beautification projects. I read through the whole thing twice, thinking there had to be some mistake. The document claimed that my property benefited from shared access roads and common areas maintained by the Eagle Crest Homeowners Association, and that I was required to pay my proportional share of recent improvements. I called the number listed on the notice and got an answering machine for the HOA management company. I left a polite message explaining that there seemed to be an error since I wasn't a member of their HOA and my property wasn't part of their development. A week went by with no response. Then I got a second notice, this time with final notice stamped in red across the top. The language was more aggressive, threatening legal action and property liens if payment wasn't received within 10 days. That's when I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to get a better understanding of what was going on. Meeting the board president. I was checking my mailbox the next afternoon when a woman in her 50s approached me from across the street. She was carrying a clipboard and had that particular energy of someone who takes their volunteer position way too seriously. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Linda, president of the Eagle Crest HOA board. I've been hoping to catch you." I introduced myself and mentioned that I'd received their assessment notices. Her demeanor immediately shifted from friendly neighbor to stern bureaucrat. "Yes, those notices," she said, consulting her clipboard. "You've been ignoring our attempts to collect your share of the infrastructure improvements. The project was approved by the board and we've already contracted the work." I explained again that I wasn't part of her HOA and shouldn't be responsible for their improvements. Linda's expression suggested I had just told her the earth was flat. "I'm afraid that's not how it works," she said, pointing toward my driveway. "That road you use to access your property serves multiple residents. 3 of our homeowners rely on that cul-de-sac for vehicle access. Since you benefit from our maintenance of the common areas, you're obligated to contribute." I looked where she was pointing. She was talking about my driveway, the one I used to get to my own house. "That's my private driveway," I told her. Linda actually laughed. "Private driveway? It's clearly a community access road. Look at how wide it is at the end. It was obviously designed to serve multiple properties. She went on to explain that the HOA had recently voted to repave all community roads and install new landscaping. The $8,500 they wanted from me represented my fair share based on the linear footage of road frontage and my property's estimated value. Besides, she added, even if you want to claim it's private, you still benefit from our community's property values. Nice neighborhoods like ours don't maintain themselves. I kept my voice level and told her I'd need to review my property documents before paying anything. Linda's clipboard clutching intensified. The board has been very patient, she said, but if we don't receive payment by the end of this week, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal remedies. Nobody wants this to become an expensive legal matter. After she left, I spent the evening digging through all my closing documents, looking for anything that might clarify the situation. My deed clearly showed that I owned everything from the main road to my house, including the entire stretch of asphalt. But I wasn't a lawyer, and Linda seemed awfully confident about the HOA's position. The pressure campaign. The next morning, I found a handwritten note on my windshield. It was signed by someone claiming to be from one of the 3 houses that used my turnaround area. The note explained how important the road maintenance was to their property values and asked me to be a good neighbor and pay my share. Over the next few days, similar notes appeared on my car, tucked under my door, and even taped to my mailbox. The tone of these messages gradually became less friendly. One note informed me that my selfishness was delaying necessary repairs that affected everyone. Another suggested that my refusal to cooperate was creating serious liability issues for the whole neighborhood. The most bizarre part was watching these neighbors interact with me in person. When I encountered them while getting mail or leaving for work, they would wave and smile like nothing was happening. But the passive-aggressive note campaign continued. Things escalated when I came home one evening to find dog waste on my lawn near the driveway. This happened 3 times over the course of a week, always in spots where it would be visible from my house but not from the street. I couldn't prove who was responsible, but the timing seemed awfully coincidental. The legal threat. 2 weeks after my conversation with Linda, I received a certified mail envelope from a law firm. Inside was a notice of intent to place lien on my property. The letter, signed by an attorney representing the HOA, claimed that I had failed to respond to numerous attempts to collect assessed fees and that legal action would commence if payment wasn't received within 15 days. The letter included language about my use and enjoyment of community infrastructure and cited several state statutes related to HOA authority and property maintenance obligations. It looked official and intimidating, exactly as intended. This was the moment I realized the situation had moved beyond neighborhood drama into actual legal territory. Instead of panicking or immediately calling a lawyer, I decided to do some research of my own. The next day, I took a personal day from work and drove to the county courthouse. I wanted to understand exactly what I owned and what the original development plans looked like. The discovery. The county clerk's office was surprisingly helpful. I explained that I needed to research the property history for a boundary dispute, and they directed me to the plat map archives. These are the official surveys and maps that show exactly how properties were divided and what infrastructure exists. I started with my property's original survey from when the house was built in 1954. The map clearly showed my lot as a single parcel extending from the main road to my house, with the entire driveway marked as private access. There was no indication that any portion was intended for shared use. Then I looked up the Eagle Crest development, which was platted and built in 1987. The developer had purchased a large tract of land adjacent to my property and divided it into the current subdivision. The development's plat map showed their internal roads and common areas, but notably did not include any portion of my driveway or property. What I found next made my day significantly more interesting. The subdivision's perimeter fence, which I could see from my kitchen window, appeared to be built partially on my land. According to the original survey stakes in the plat maps, the fence was approximately 4 feet inside my property line along the entire back section. I asked the clerk to print copies of everything. She gave me the original 1954 survey, the 1987 development plat, and several intermediate documents showing property transfers over the years. The paper trail was crystal clear. I owned my driveway entirely, and the HOA had built their fence on my property. Armed with this information, I felt much more confident about dealing with Linda and her board. Setting the trap. Instead of immediately confronting the HOA with what I'd discovered, I decided to be strategic. I wanted them to commit to their position in writing before revealing what I knew. I sent a polite email to the HOA management company, copying Linda and the lawyer who had sent the lien threat. The email was carefully worded. I'm writing to request clarification regarding the recent assessment notice. Before I can respond appropriately, I need the HOA to provide documentation showing the exact boundaries and coordinates of the shared access road referenced in your demand for payment. Specifically, I need to understand which portions of the roadway the HOA claims jurisdiction over and the legal basis for that claim. Please provide a survey or plat map showing the precise location of any community infrastructure I'm allegedly obligated to maintain. I sent this on a Tuesday morning and waited. Linda responded by Thursday, and her email was exactly what I needed. She attached a hand-drawn map showing my entire driveway marked as Community Access Road, HOA Jurisdiction, and wrote, "As you can see from the attached diagram, the roadway providing access to your property is part of our community's shared infrastructure. The Eagle Crest HOA has maintained this access road for years and has clear authority over its upkeep and improvement." But the real treasure came the following Monday. The HOA's lawyer sent a formal response via certified mail. The letter stated, "Our client, the Eagle Crest Homeowners Association, has established jurisdiction over the access roadway leading to your property through continuous maintenance and community use. This roadway constitutes public shared access under HOA jurisdiction, and your property's use of said infrastructure creates a legal obligation for proportional maintenance contributions." They had just put their false claim in writing on legal letterhead in a way that would be admissible in court. The response. I spent that weekend researching fence and gate contractors. I wanted someone who could work quickly and install something substantial. After getting quotes from 3 companies, I hired a contractor who specialized in automated security gates for rural properties. Monday morning, I took another personal day. The contractors arrived at 7 a.m. with a truck full of materials, steel fence posts, heavy-duty gate hardware, and a motorized gate system that looked like it belonged at a commercial facility. By 5 p.m. that evening, my property had a new feature. A solid steel gate now blocked the entrance to my driveway, complete with no trespassing and private property signs mounted on both sides. The gate was positioned exactly at my property line, where my driveway met the public road. I also had the contractors install a few additional private property signs along the fence line where the HOA's perimeter fence crossed into my land. The gate was operated by a remote control and had a manual override key. It was substantial enough that nobody would be driving through it by accident. Then I waited. The explosion. I didn't have to wait long. By 7 p.m., my phone was ringing non-stop. Linda left 3 increasingly frantic voicemails demanding that I remove the illegal obstruction immediately. The neighbors who had been using my turnaround area were apparently trapped, unable to access their rear garages without backing down their long driveways. The next morning brought more drama. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when Linda arrived with 2 other board members and someone I assumed was the HOA's property manager. They marched up to the gate and started taking pictures and making phone calls. Linda spotted me on the porch and shouted across the distance that I was blocking a public thoroughfare and that she had already called the police. She demanded that I open the gate immediately or face criminal charges. I waved politely and went back to reading my newspaper. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. The officer got out and walked over to examine the gate and signs. Linda immediately approached him with her clipboard and began explaining how I was illegally blocking community access. I walked down to join the conversation, bringing my folder of county documents. The officer asked for my side of the story. I handed him copies of my property survey and the original plat maps, explaining that this was my private driveway on my private property. I also showed him the email and letter from the HOA claiming jurisdiction over my land. The officer studied the documents for several minutes while Linda continued insisting that the road was community property and that I couldn't just block it. Finally, the officer looked up. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "according to these county records, this is private property. The gentleman has every right to control access to his own driveway. If you believe you have some legal right to use this roadway, that's a civil matter you'll need to resolve in court." Linda's face went through several color changes, But they use our roads. They benefit from our maintenance. The officer pointed to the survey. I don't see any community roads on his property. I see a private driveway that leads to a private residence. After the officer left, Linda stood by the gate for another 10 minutes, apparently trying to process what had just happened. The other board members were making phone calls, probably to their lawyer. The counterattack. That afternoon, I received a call from the HOA's attorney. His tone was much less aggressive than his previous letter. We need to discuss this gate situation, he said. My clients are concerned about access issues and potential safety problems. I told him I was happy to discuss the situation, but first I had some questions about the HOA's fence. There was a long pause. What fence? I explained that according to the county surveys, the HOA's perimeter fence was built approximately 4 feet inside my property line. I mentioned that I'd been very patient about this encroachment, but given the HOA's recent aggressive stance about property rights, I felt it was time to address the boundary issue. Another pause. Let me review some documents and get back to you. He never called back. The bill. Instead of waiting for the lawyer, I decided to take initiative. I drafted my own formal letter and had it hand-delivered to Linda's house with copies sent to each board member and the property management company. The letter was titled Invoice for Land Lease, Past Due, and itemized 10 years of unauthorized use of my property by the HOA's perimeter fence. I calculated the rental value at $1,000 per month for the strip of land their fence occupied, backdated to when the fence was originally installed. The total amount due, $120,000. The letter explained that while I had previously allowed this encroachment out of neighborly goodness, the HOA's recent claims about my property obligations had made it clear that we needed to formalize all property relationships. I offered to waive the past due amount if the HOA immediately withdrew their assessment demand and relocated their fence to the correct property line within 30 days. I also mentioned that failure to resolve this matter promptly would result in a formal trespassing and land use lawsuit, with additional claims for property damage and legal fees. The capitulation. The response came faster than I expected. Linda called me directly the next morning, and for the first time since I'd met her, she sounded less than completely confident. She asked if we could meet in person to work out a reasonable solution that benefits everyone. I agreed to meet at the gate, my gate, that afternoon. Linda arrived with just one other board member this time, and notably no clipboard. She looked like she hadn't slept much. We may have misunderstood the property boundaries, she began carefully. The board would like to propose a compromise. The compromise was simple. The HOA would immediately withdraw their $8,500 assessment and cover the cost of surveying and relocating their fence to the correct property line. In exchange, I would waive my land lease claim and allow a 60-day timeline for the fence relocation. I told her I'd consider the offer, but I had one additional requirement: a written apology letter acknowledging that my driveway was private property and that the HOA had no jurisdiction over it. Linda looked like she was swallowing something unpleasant, but she agreed. The resolution. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA board. The letter withdrew their assessment demand due to boundary clarification and included language acknowledging that my driveway was private property outside of HOA jurisdiction. The apology was brief but clear. The board regrets any confusion regarding property boundaries and acknowledges that all assessment demands related to your private driveway were made in error. More importantly, I received a check for $150 to cover my costs for the county record research, along with a timeline showing that the fence relocation would begin within the month. The fence project ended up costing the HOA approximately $12,000, paid for by dipping into their reserve fund. This was the same money they had been collecting from other homeowners for their beautification project. As for my 3 neighbors who had been using my turnaround area, they had to get creative. One installed a small turnaround pad on his own property. The other 2 learned to back their large SUVs down their narrow driveways. I heard through casual conversation that this led to some heated discussions at the next HOA meeting about driveway design standards for future homes. The aftermath. The gate remains installed and functional. I open it with a remote control when I leave for work each morning and close it when I return home. It's become part of my daily routine, and I actually appreciate the extra privacy it provides. Linda stepped down as HOA president a few months later. The official reason given was that she wanted to focus on family commitments, but I suspect the fence debacle and the associated costs didn't help her reputation among the homeowners who had to pay for the mistake. The new board president is much more reasonable. We've had exactly one interaction since the fence situation was resolved. She waved politely when I was checking my mail last week and mentioned that they were planning some new landscaping near the front entrance. She made no mention of assessments or shared responsibilities. My property values certainly haven't suffered from the gate installation. If anything, the additional privacy and security features probably add value. The automated gate has become a conversation piece when friends visit, especially after I tell them the story of how it came to be installed. Lessons learned. Looking back on this whole situation, I learned several valuable lessons about dealing with overreaching HOAs and property disputes. First, documentation is everything. If I hadn't taken the time to research the county records and get copies of all the relevant surveys and plat maps, I would have been arguing from a position of ignorance. Linda and the HOA board were counting on me not knowing my actual property rights. Second, sometimes it pays to let the other side commit to their position before revealing what you know. By asking the HOA to clarify their claims in writing, I got them to document their false assertions about my property. This made it much harder for them to backtrack or claim they had been misunderstood. Third, the threat of expensive litigation tends to focus people's attention wonderfully. While I was prepared to defend my property rights in court if necessary, the HOA's lawyer clearly advised them that they were in an untenable position once the actual property boundaries were established. Fourth, neighborhood bullies often fold quickly when confronted with someone who won't be intimidated. Linda's entire strategy was based on assuming I would either pay up quietly or get overwhelmed by their legal threats. When I responded with my own documentation and demands, she found herself in unfamiliar territory. The bigger picture. This experience also taught me something about how these HOA power struggles develop. Linda and her board had probably gotten used to homeowners who would grumble but ultimately comply with their demands. They had created a system where they could make rules and assessments with minimal pushback. The problem was that they had started believing their own authority extended beyond their actual jurisdiction. They had been maintaining the appearance of control over my driveway for years, probably without ever checking whether they actually had any legal right to do so. When I bought the property, the previous owner had probably just tolerated the neighbors using his turnaround area rather than making an issue of it. This created an assumption of community use that the HOA mistook for community ownership. The passive-aggressive note campaign and the dog waste incidents showed how quickly supposed community leaders can resort to petty harassment when their authority is questioned. These are the same people who probably lecture others about property values and neighborhood standards. Current status. Today, I enjoy my coffee each morning on the front porch, watching the occasional HOA board member drive by without making eye contact. The automated gate opens and closes smoothly, and I've never regretted the installation cost. The 3 neighbors who used to use my turnaround area have adapted to their new reality. I occasionally see them struggling with complicated backing maneuvers, but they've managed to avoid any major vehicle damage as far as I know. The HOA's relocated fence looks perfectly fine in its new location, properly positioned on their own property. I assume their reserve fund has recovered from the unexpected expense, though I imagine the other homeowners weren't thrilled about having to pay for the board's mistake. Linda has apparently moved to a different neighborhood. I heard through casual conversation that she and her husband sold their house about 6 months after the fence incident. Whether this was related to the HOA situation or just coincidental timing, I couldn't say. The current HOA board appears to have learned from their predecessors' mistakes. They stick to managing their own community areas and haven't made any attempts to claim jurisdiction over properties outside their development. As for my property values and neighborhood relations, everything has settled into a comfortable routine. I maintain my land, respect my neighbors' boundaries, and expect the same in return. The gate has never been a problem for delivery drivers, service providers, or guests, all of whom seem to understand that it's simply a security feature. Final thoughts. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just paid the $8,500 when Linda first demanded it. The HOA would have continued operating under false assumptions about their authority, and I would have been subsidizing their projects indefinitely. More importantly, the next property owner who questioned their overreach might not have had access to the same documentation or legal resources to push back effectively. In the end, this wasn't really about money or road maintenance. It was about a small group of people who had convinced themselves they had authority they didn't actually possess, and who were willing to use intimidation tactics to enforce their imaginary jurisdiction. The gate that now protects my driveway serves as a daily reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to make them prove their claims in writing, then hold them accountable for the consequences. And every evening when I use the remote control to close that gate behind me, I'm reminded that home ownership comes with both rights and responsibilities. But the most important right is the ability to decide who gets to use your own property. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way, and it cost them considerably more than the $8,500 they had tried to extract from me. But I suspect the real cost was the credibility they lost with their own homeowners when the truth about their property claims finally came to light. These days, when I see Linda's replacement at community events or around the neighborhood, our interactions are polite but brief. There's an understanding that we both know exactly where the property boundaries are, and that those boundaries will be respected. As I finish writing this, I can see out my kitchen window to where the HOA's fence now sits properly positioned on their own land. It's a small detail that most people would never notice, but it represents something much more significant: the difference between actual authority and the illusion of power. The gate at the end of my driveway opens and closes dozens of times each week, a simple mechanical process that solved a complicated human problem. Sometimes the simplest solutions really are the most effective ones. I still live in the same beautiful house at the end of the same private driveway, but now everyone involved understands exactly what that means. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted in the first place, just to be left alone to enjoy the property I purchased, without harassment from neighbors who thought they could bully me into paying for their projects. The remote control for my gate sits on my kitchen counter, a small plastic device that represents one of the most satisfying expenditures I've ever made. Every time I press that button, I'm reminded that sometimes standing up to unreasonable demands isn't just about principle. It's about setting boundaries that protect you from future problems, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a lesson worth sharing with anyone who finds themselves dealing with similar neighborhood power struggles. Sometimes you have to build a gate to teach people where your property lines actually are. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 15 years ago, I was almost 20 and attending my country's equivalent of a trade school for electricians. One of our teachers, who taught electronic circuits, had a pretty annoying catchphrase for every question students asked. "No problems, just look in your textbook." He had clearly already mentally checked out, since he had a much better job lined up for the next semester. Because of that, he mostly just read straight from the textbook and then moved on to the textbook's practical exercises. These involved working in pairs with a breadboard, inserting resistors, capacitors, and other components. Overall, he was not the worst teacher we had, but one particular incident made his class very memorable. On the third class we had with him, the first being introductions and the second covering how to read resistor color codes, he had already used his catchphrase at least 5 times per class. During that third class, my friend showed me a glaring mistake in the textbook's practical exercise. The exercise was very simple. We were supposed to place 3 resistors in series, power them with a 24-volt DC supply, measure the current, and compare it to the calculated value. The first 2 exercises were fine, but in the third one, the resistor values were way too low, off by 3 orders of magnitude. Someone had clearly meant to write 10,000 ohms, but instead wrote 10 ohms. For every single resistor in that exercise. For people not very familiar with electronics, lower resistance means higher current when the voltage stays the same. Higher current also means much more power being dissipated as heat. Resistors have a power rating measured in watts, and when that rating is exceeded, they start to smoke or catch fire. The resistors we were using were rated for 0.25 watts. With 3 10-ohm resistors in series, the total resistance would be 30 ohms. At 24 volts, that results in about 0.8 amps of current and roughly 19 watts of power. That is about 77 times the rated power of the resistors, if the intended 10,000 ohm resistors had been used instead. The current and power would have been well within safe limits. My friend, a few other students, and I tried to point this out to the teacher and asked whether the values were correct. His response, unsurprisingly, was, No problems, just look in your textbook. I tried to argue that the textbook was clearly wrong, but he shut me down, saying that much smarter people than either of us had written it, so we should just follow it. So everyone, some more reluctantly than others, placed the resistors into their breadboards and connected the power supply. Just like in the first two exercises, we waited for his instruction to turn it on. Then he told us to turn on the power supply without even looking in the textbook. At first, everything seemed fine, and some people started grabbing their multimeters. A few seconds later, a girl screamed, "Fire," though at first it was just smoke. A few seconds after that, there were small fires all over the lab, and people started freaking out. Nothing dramatic, and the fires died down quickly, but it was enough to make most of the 30 students panic. The smell of burnt plastic from about 15 breadboards and burnt ceramic from 45 resistors made the air almost unbreathable. To his credit, the teacher quickly shut off the lab's circuit breaker and evacuated the room so no one breathed in potentially toxic fumes. Since I had expected this to happen, I was more annoyed than scared, unlike some students who were crying. I told the teacher, who was staring into the empty lab like he had seen a ghost, "There seems to be a problem. Maybe you should look in the textbook now." He laughed nervously and said, "Maybe you are smarter than the people who wrote it." The screaming had attracted a more experienced teacher, who after making sure everyone was okay, could not stop laughing at our teacher. He kept using his catchphrase, "No problems, just look in your textbook," until the end of the semester. The difference was that now he actually looked in the textbook himself and started spotting several other glaring mistakes made by those intelligent people. For some reason, he did not seem to like the nickname we gave him after someone was overheard in the hallway saying, "Next is textbook idiots class." The next one is an entitled people story. About a year ago, we went to Mexico to get my husband's dog. I had deliberately booked a direct flight from Mexico City to Chicago because the poor baby had to travel in the luggage compartment. I wanted to go up once, be in the air for 4 hours, come down once, and take her straight outside to pee, especially because she had never flown before and because we had to hand her over to the airline, sealed in her crate 2.5 hours before our flight even boarded. But best laid plans and so on and so forth. The only flight that suited us timing and money-wise was on one of the budget Mexican airlines, which, if you've never done it before, I recommend. I low-key love flying on budget Mexican airlines. It's inexpensive as hell and kind of hilarious. They have ads on the baggage compartment covers like you're on the subway or the bus, and everyone brings full meals with them because they charge you even for water. In my experience, everyone is in a good mood, but I won't repeat this particular flight because they had stuffed so many extra seats into that plane that it unexpectedly weighed too much, and we had to make an unplanned stop in a northern Mexican city in order to refuel. So our flight that was supposed to get into Chicago around midnight ended up getting in around 3 a.m. We mostly threw immigration pretty quickly. We were the only flight landing at that time. My husband was traveling on advance parole, and I'm a U.S. citizen, so they separated us at the border and I had to go wait in the baggage claim area by myself. Pretty much the whole plane load of people was waiting and 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 waiting, trapped in that weird liminal space between immigration and customs. I guess the baggage handlers have shift change at 3 a.m., or only 2 are on that late night shift. Because we waited at least 45 minutes before any bags came down the ramp, despite being the only flight landing at that hour. And even then, they came out in dribs and drabs and little spurts like an old man with prostate problems trying to pee. I was off in the corner waiting for them to bring our pup through the oversized baggage door, and here comes this woman with her itty-bitty dog. She was one of those ladies with epic nails and impeccable hair, even at 3:45 in the morning, and she had this little fluffball dog trotting along behind her on a bejeweled leash. There were signs all over the place saying that animals must remain in crates, but she had taken her little dog out and was hustling him all around, leading him to corners and likely targets like the rent-a-cart rail, encouraging him to do his business. She spent a lot of time over where I and this other guy were waiting for oversized baggage/animals, probably because there were fewer people over there, but she looped perimeter of the whole area 3 or 4 times. Finally, on her 4th or 5th pass, an airport security dude who looked like he was one coffee shy of high blood pressure crisis came over and told her to put her dog back in the bag she was carrying. She started to explain to him that the flight had been so long, and her little precious had to pee. He couldn't be expected to hold it for that long, and now it was the airport's fault that they were trapped, waiting for her bags, and she didn't want her little dog to suffer. Airport security told her to pack up the dog. She started to say how she couldn't possibly, her poor dog, so unfair, etc. Airport security pointed to one of the signs and again told her to pack up the dog, so she just huffed away from him, literally turned her back and walked away, leading her dog into corners and crevices and encouraging him, "Let it all out." I had nothing else to do and was happy to not worry so much about what was taking my husband so long, so I just watched as airport security went off toward the doors that lead toward customs and got another officer, this one with different insignia and handcuffs hanging from the back of his belt. They caught up with her when she was halfway across the baggage claim area. I could see her gesturing and shaking her head. I could hear her voice rise but not make out any words as she pointed at the dog and the empty ramp and luggage belt. Finally, the second security dude/law enforcement officer reached behind his back and brought out the handcuffs, at which point she bent over, scooped her dog into his bag, and appeared to meekly listen as they told her something else before finally going back to their usual posts. At this point, but my dog and my husband were released from stupid border limbo almost simultaneously. Different doors, though, so I lost track of her. But I'm sure, had she succeeded, she would have left her doggy dookie right in the middle of the floor for everyone to step on, just like the woman in that post. Anyway, thank you for watching.